The sun rose over the fields of Alabama, casting a sharp light across the endless rows of cotton that swayed under the heavy hand of the overseers. On the Darnell plantation, where the harsh cries of the whip and the crack of authority echoed through the fields, there existed a silence deeper than any fear. Elijah, a deaf slave, had known this silence all his life. It was a curse, yes, but it was also his strength. In a world where every sound held the weight of command, every shout carried the threat of punishment, Elijah's silence had allowed him to see what others could not. While the others labored under the constant watch of Overseer Briggs, Elijah had learned to move without detection, to watch and listen without truly hearing. And as the world around him raged with cruelty, he remained a shadow, biding his time, waiting for the moment when the masters would finally hear the consequences of their actions. Margaret Hargrove, the overseer's wife, was a woman of arrogance, beauty, and cruelty. She never thought twice about the lives of those she called servants, nor did she ever consider that there could be consequences to her relentless treatment of the enslaved. But in Elijah's silence, she had underestimated him, and it would be her undoing. This is the story of the night Elijah would make his voice heard, not with words, not with shouts, but with a single act of vengeance that would shake the plantation to its core. It is the story of a man who had been silenced for far too long, and the price that would be paid for his silence to be finally broken. Before we dive into this silent act of revenge, I ask you, where are you watching from? What time is it there? Can you hear the silence of this moment, where retribution is planned in the shadows? Drop a comment below, and if stories of courage, power, and defiance speak to you, hit subscribe. Because what you're about to hear is the tale of vengeance carried out without a sound. The Darnell plantation stretched for miles under the harsh southern Sunday. Endless fields of cotton rippled like an ocean of white, each plant a reminder of the labor that fueled the estate's prosperity. Among the enslaved workers, one man stood apart: Elijah. The others moved like a blur of forced motion under the overseer's watchful eye, their backs bent, heads lowered, their bodies moving in unison to the rhythm of oppression. But Elijah, though a part of the labor force, moved differently. Elijah's deafness, once seen as a weakness by those who ruled the plantation, had become his shield. He could not hear the cruel orders barked by Overseer Briggs, nor could he hear the threats or the insults that were often hurled at him. At first, the overseer's frustration had been palpable. Briggs, like all of the overseers, enjoyed the control he wielded over the enslaved workers, and the inability to make Elijah comply through command grated on him. But over time, Briggs had come to believe Elijah was simply slow, broken, and unfit for anything other than the hard labor assigned to him. What Briggs didn't know, what none of the overseers realized, was that Elijah had become a quiet observer. He watched everything: the subtle movements of the house staff, the cruel whispers between the overseers, the moments of weakness in the plantation's operations. And with each passing day, his mind grew sharper, his body more attuned to the rhythms of the plantation, and the secrets of the masters more apparent. It was midday when the call came, as it always did. The bell rang out across the fields, signaling the end of the workday. Elijah moved slowly, methodically, to his quarters, not out of fatigue, but because he had learned that his time was his greatest ally. While others rushed for rest, he watched, listened, and took note of each small detail. Inside the mansion, Margaret Hargrove, beautiful, cold, and indifferent, walked with her head held high, her dress sweeping the floors like a queen's gown. She had always looked down on Elijah and the others, seeing them as nothing more than instruments to be used. She would walk among the workers at times, mockingly issuing orders, reminding them of their place with a casual cruelty. But Elijah, ever silent, was different. His eyes never met hers, and yet, in his own way, he was always present, watching, waiting, understanding. He had never spoken to Margaret, never even been given the chance to. To her, he was just another tool, one whose silence was nothing more than an inconvenience. But in that silence, Elijah had watched the cruelty of the plantation unfold. He had seen Margaret's arrogance, her disregard for the lives she ruled over, and every injustice, every insult, every act of degradation he witnessed only built the quiet rage inside him. Elijah knew that, for him, silence would be his greatest weapon. He could not hear his master's orders, but he could feel them. He could sense them, and soon, it would be time for the silence to speak louder than any cry for mercy. The days that followed were full of the same monotonous rhythm. The workers, broken yet resilient, labored in the fields while the overseers barked orders. The heat of the sun seemed to beat down harder, but it was nothing compared to the heat that churned in Elijah's chest. Each blow of the whip, each command from the overseer, fed the fire inside him, and each silent act of defiance added to his resolve. Tonight, when the stars rose over the horizon and the house slept under the blanket of night, Elijah would finally make his move. There would be no shouting, no violence, no demands for attention. Only the quiet precision of a man who had been silenced for far too long. Elijah's revenge would be calculated, silent, and final. The time for waiting was over. The days passed like the endless rows of cotton, sweat-streaked and unforgiving. Elijah moved through the plantation with the patience of a man who had already calculated every step of his plan. His silence had once been seen as a weakness, but now it had become his strength. The overseers, especially Mr. Briggs, thought nothing of him. He was simply the quiet one, the one who didn't flinch at the lash, who never cried out in pain, whose stoic silence seemed to make him an easy target. But they were wrong. Elijah's silence was not a mark of submission. It was the ultimate form of control. He had learned to live in a world where every sound was an order, a command, a reminder of his position as a piece of property. But in the absence of sound, Elijah had gained something more valuable: awareness. He saw the patterns. He understood the rhythms of the plantation, the unspoken cues that kept the machinery of cruelty in motion. And he knew that one small shift, one calculated action, could bring the whole system to a grinding halt. Mr. Briggs, with his gruff voice and sharp tongue, had become Elijah's greatest tormentor. The overseer delighted in watching Elijah work. No commands, no complaints, no resistance, just the steady, silent labor of a man who was less than human in the eyes of the master. Every day, Briggs would find new ways to test Elijah's obedience: an extra hour in the fields, a public scolding for something trivial, just to watch the others cower, and Elijah remain unbroken. But it wasn't just Briggs that had shaped the resentment growing in Elijah's chest. Margaret, the overseer's wife, had long been a figure of scorn and disdain for the enslaved. Her cruelty was less overt but no less venomous. She would stroll through the fields in her elaborate dresses, her heels clicking sharply against the earth, reminding the enslaved of their place. It was in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and the air grew thick with the hum of insects, that Elijah began to notice the subtle ways in which Margaret took pleasure in the suffering of the enslaved. She would stand in the shade of the porch, watching the workers toil below, a smug smile on her face as she surveyed them like livestock. Her glances were sharp and dismissive, but her words were the cruelest of all. She spoke as if they could not understand her, mocking them in front of the overseers and anyone else who happened to be near. Elijah had often caught her speaking in whispers to Briggs, her voice full of disdain for those she deemed beneath her. But her cruelty had taken on a new edge over time. Margaret no longer simply watched from afar. She began to find ways to personally humiliate Elijah. She would send him on meaningless errands, knowing he couldn't hear her commands in the loud clamor of the estate. When he didn't respond, she would glare at him, angry at his disobedience, even though he couldn't possibly hear her. It was a subtle form of degradation, forcing him to fail in front of others, forcing him to be punished for something he had no control over. One evening, after another of Margaret's mocking orders, Elijah stood still in the field, his gaze turned to the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of the river, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to walk away from all of this. To hear no more insults, no more commands, no more whips or lashes. But it wasn't just Margaret who had sparked the growing fire in his chest. It was the years of subjugation, the years of silent endurance, the years of watching others suffer, watching their spirits break under the weight of their master's cruelty. It was the collective pain of every enslaved person, every back bent under the weight of forced labor, every cry of anguish muffled by the sound of a whip. Elijah had endured it all, but now that endurance had morphed into something else, something more dangerous. As the days passed, the resentment in Elijah's heart turned from quiet fury into something more tangible, a plan. He knew the risks, knew the consequences, but he also knew the cost of inaction. His revenge would not come in the form of a loud outburst or a dramatic confrontation. It would come in the dead of night, when the plantation slept, and silence was his only ally. He would make sure they could never forget that even in silence, a man could be heard. The plan began to take shape in his mind, each detail becoming clearer with every passing hour. Elijah had seen the ways the Hargroves had treated him, had treated all of them. He had learned to navigate the plantation's landscape, to blend into the background, to move unnoticed. And in that silence, he would execute the one act that would make them hear him and make them understand the cost of their cruelty. But as the days drew to a close, and the moon rose higher in the sky, Elijah knew that the time to act was drawing near. The night would come, and with it, the silence would speak louder than any cry for mercy. The darnel plantation was still. The only sounds, the occasional rustling of the wind in the cotton fields and the distant croak of frogs in the swamp. The day had been long, and the workers had trudged through the hours, broken by the endless labor. The overseers went through the motions of their duties, shouting commands, cracking their whips, and demanding ever more from those they saw as tools. And then there was Margaret, smiling coldly, her expression one of detached amusement, as if the suffering of the slaves around her was nothing more than a performance for her entertainment. Elijah moved through the grounds, his steps deliberate but light, avoiding the gaze of those around him. He had spent days carefully crafting every detail of his plan, watching, waiting, ensuring that when the moment came, everything would fall into place. Every part of the estate had become familiar to him, the creaking of the doors, the layout of the mansion, the positions of the overseers, and even the vulnerable moments of those who thought themselves untouchable. He had learned their weaknesses in silence. It was the evening before his act of revenge, and the quiet of the night weighed heavily on him. He knew that tomorrow, everything would change. The tension that had been building inside him for years, the frustration, the anger, the quiet desire for justice, would be released in a single, irreversible moment. The silence would speak louder than any shout or scream ever could. But before that moment could arrive, Elijah had to put the final pieces of his plan in motion. He had already ensured that the overseers would be distracted. He had carefully manipulated events to ensure their attention was elsewhere. They had grown complacent, confident that the silent workers, the ones like him, would never rise up. They thought they were in control, but they had underestimated the most dangerous thing of all: silence. The slaves had been working in the fields, their movements heavy with the burden of their labor. But tonight, they would not be working. Tonight, they would be still, waiting, watching the shadows as the night unfolded. In the mansion, Margaret had just finished her evening routine. She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair, unaware of the storm brewing outside. She had no idea that the very people she had tormented for so long were about to make a decision that would change everything. Elijah, standing in the shadows of the slave quarters, exhaled slowly. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was steady. He was ready. The plan had been set for weeks. He knew what had to be done. The overseers would be none the wiser, and Margaret would never see it coming. But even as the plan took shape, Elijah couldn't help but feel a twinge of something else, something he had not expected. There was no fear in his heart, only resolve. But in the silence of the night, there was a strange sadness. It wasn't for himself. He knew he was doing what needed to be done, but for the world he had been forced to live in, for the lives of those who had been broken, and for the life he had been denied. This was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his humanity, and his sense of self. Margaret and the overseers had stolen that from him, and now, in the silence of his actions, he would take it back. That night, the stars shone brightly above the plantation. The moon was full, casting pale light over the mansion and the fields. The air was thick with the sounds of the night. Crickets chirped in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the faint creak of the old house. But in the quiet, there was an unsettling tension. It was a night like any other, but for Elijah, It was a night that would forever change the course of his life. The time had come. Elijah moved swiftly, like a shadow through the underbrush, moving with purpose, his body low to the ground. He approached the mansion from the back, where the servants' entrance was. He had been there countless times, unnoticed, silent. Tonight, he would not be a mere servant. He would be the one in control. He crept through the corridors of the mansion, the scent of perfumes and polished wood hanging in the air. The house was quiet, Margaret was alone in her chambers, and the overseers were nowhere to be seen. The time was perfect. Elijah took a deep breath as he approached the door to Margaret's quarters. He could hear her faintly inside, humming a tune to herself as she prepared for bed. Her back was turned when he entered, and before she could even react, he was upon her. The moment was swift, and it was quiet. Elijah's hands were like iron as he seized her, preventing any sound from escaping her lips. Margaret struggled, her panic rising as she realized what was happening, but her cries were smothered, her voice lost in the suffocating silence. She couldn't beg, she couldn't scream, and that, in itself, was the most powerful thing Elijah had ever done. The room was suffocating in its stillness, the heavy silence pressing down on both Elijah and Margaret. In the dim glow of the candlelight, Margaret's struggles grew frantic, but the grip Elijah held on her was unyielding. Her breath quickened, each desperate gasp of air cutting through the tension that hung between them like a taut wire. Margaret had never imagined this. The thought that one of her slaves, one of the people she had tormented and belittled, would rise against her in such a way was beyond her comprehension. She had always been in control. Always. She was the wife of the overseer, mistress of the estate, and she had walked the grounds with the arrogant belief that the enslaved were nothing but tools beneath her, tools that existed to serve her whims. But now, with Elijah's strong hands holding her in place, that illusion was shattered. The world she had created, the world where she wielded power without question, was crumbling before her. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for any means of escape, but there was no way out. The door was closed, and the windows were shut tight. There was only Elijah, his face calm and resolute, a silent force that she could not escape. The silence between them was suffocating. Elijah's body was rigid, every muscle taut with purpose. He did not need words he never had. His revenge would not be loud, not dramatic. It would be quiet, precise, and irrevocable. Margaret had broken him in ways she would never understand, and now he would repay her in the same silence that had been forced upon him for so many years. Margaret's eyes, wide with fear, finally met his. "You," she gasped, but her voice was muffled by his hand, her words disappearing into the thick air between them. "You can't," but she didn't need to finish her sentence. Elijah had heard the threats and the insults countless times, but now, his silence spoke louder than any of her words ever could. In this moment, he was no longer just a slave. He was a man who had taken back his dignity. He was a man who had chosen this moment, this act, and who now held the power in his hands. With a single motion, Elijah removed his hand from her mouth, but he did not release her. Margaret's eyes filled with terror, but there was nowhere for her to turn. She struggled against him, her hands flailing, but Elijah's strength was unmatched. "Elijah," she begged, her voice cracking as panic set in. "Please, I beg you, please don't do this." But Elijah's expression remained unchanged. He had heard her pleas for years, and they had always fallen on deaf ears. Now, it was her turn to experience the silence of someone who had been broken but had found their voice. It was a silence that held more power than any words could ever express. In that moment, Elijah knew that there was no turning back. The chains that had bound him for so long, those invisible chains of oppression and subjugation, were gone. He had freed himself with one swift action, and now, in the quiet of the night, he would make Margaret feel the weight of that freedom. With precise, deliberate motions, Elijah carried out the act. There was no sound, no cries, no pleas, only the faint rustling of fabric and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a man who had waited years for this very moment. And then, it was done. Margaret lay still, her body slack in Elijah's grip. Her terror had faded into a quiet finality, the consequence of her cruelty and her unyielding sense of superiority. She would never again walk the plantation with the same arrogance. She would never again look down on those she had enslaved, those she had tortured, those she had dehumanized. Elijah stood over her, his breathing steady, his heart pounding in his chest, not with fear, but with a strange sense of liberation. The silence of the night was no longer oppressive. It was his ally. His revenge, though silent, had been heard. The years of abuse, the years of suffering, had been repaid in full. For a moment, Elijah allowed himself to linger in that quiet space, savoring the stillness. Margaret, the overseer's wife, had begged for mercy, but Elijah had not listened. The world had gone silent, and in that silence, he had found his voice. He stepped away from her body, his hands still trembling slightly from the tension, but his resolve unshaken. This was not the end, he knew. There would be consequences, there always were, but in this moment, Elijah had made a choice. And that choice would echo through the halls of the plantation forever. The plantation was eerily quiet the next morning, the usual sounds of work muted by the fear that had descended upon the estate. The cotton fields, normally alive with the hum of labor, seemed to stretch on forever in silence. The overseers, usually so vocal and commanding, now moved with hesitation, their eyes darting nervously as they walked past the slave quarters. The estate had not yet recovered from the shock of what had occurred, and the tension that gripped the air felt as thick as the heat from the rising Sunday. Samuel Hargrove, the overseer, returned from a business trip and immediately sensed that something was amiss. There was a weight to the atmosphere that he could not shake, something unspoken but palpable. The usual hum of the plantation was gone, replaced by a haunting stillness. When he entered the mansion, he immediately noticed the absence of his wife, Margaret. Her room was empty, the door ajar, and there was no sign of her in the house. The overseers and house staff had already begun to murmur, whispers of Margaret's disappearance spreading like wildfire. Samuel's heart skipped in his chest. He had known his wife to be cruel and condescending, but he never thought she would vanish so suddenly. Panic and frustration twisted in his gut as he scoured the house, searching for any trace of her. "Where is she?" Samuel demanded of the overseers, his voice rising with growing anger. They could offer no answers. The staff could only point to the garden, where they'd last seen Margaret the evening before, walking alone. The tension only deepened as the overseers began to investigate the plantation, their steps more cautious, as if they feared what they might find. It wasn't until they reached the garden, still locked in the dim light of the early morning, that they saw the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Margaret's personal belongings, her clothing, her perfume were scattered across the ground. Her parasol was abandoned on the soft earth, the delicate fabric torn and dirty. There was no trace of her, no sign of life, only the lingering scent of perfume and the marks of her struggle. Samuel's blood ran cold. This was no simple disappearance. This was a deliberate act of violence, and the silence of the plantation was now broken by the realization that his wife, the woman who had commanded the plantation with cruelty, was gone. The overseers immediately turned their suspicion to the enslaved workers. They could not fathom that any of them would have the audacity to strike against the Hargrove family. But the tension, the fear, was inescapable. The slaves, who had always been quiet in the face of torment, now moved like shadows, their eyes avoiding contact, their heads low in a mixture of fear and reverence. They knew that something had changed, but none dared speak of it openly. Chike, who had become the quiet leader among the enslaved, knew that the consequences would be severe. He had expected retaliation, but nothing of this magnitude. The rebellion was now known. The act of defiance that had been carried out so swiftly and silently would now be the subject of rumors, of whispers in every corner of the estate. And yet, the slaves did not speak of it aloud. Fear had been replaced by something else, something that stirred in the hearts of the workers. It was not fear of retribution that gripped them now, but a strange, lingering sense of triumph. The overseers began searching the slave quarters, their eyes narrowed, their hands gripping their whips. They demanded answers, but no one spoke. Chike remained silent, his gaze steady. He had not expected the consequences to come so quickly, but in that moment, he knew there was no going back. Samuel Hargrove, fueled by rage and desperation, called for an assembly of the enslaved workers. He stood in front of them, his voice trembling with anger as he demanded the whereabouts of his wife. But his words fell on deaf ears. No one moved. No one spoke. "The one who did this will pay," Samuel snarled, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Whoever harmed my wife will feel the full weight of my wrath." But still, no one spoke. Elijah's revenge had been executed in silence, and in silence it would remain. The overseers, unable to extract any answers, grew more frustrated. The workers, sensing the change, could not bear to break the silence. As the day wore on, the mood on the plantation shifted. The overseers continued their searches, interrogating the workers. But there were no answers. The silence of Elijah's actions had infected the estate like a sickness. Margaret's disappearance became a subject of whispers, a forbidden topic that no one dared to discuss openly. In the quarters, Chike and the others gathered once more. The fear that had once gripped them was gone, replaced by something else, a quiet, shared understanding. They had done the unthinkable, and though the consequences would be harsh, they had reclaimed their dignity, their power. They were no longer invisible, no longer willing to be silent victims. "Elijah has made his stand," Chike said quietly, his voice full of quiet pride. "And with his silence, he has given us all the courage to speak, even if our words are never heard." The days that followed Margaret's disappearance were shrouded in a heavy fog of dread. The plantation, once a place of rigid control and daily oppression, had become a house of whispers and half-formed glances. The overseers were on edge, unable to understand how their usual methods of power, threats, punishments, fear, had been so easily outmaneuvered. The Hargrove estate, long a symbol of dominance, now felt like a hollow shell. The fear that had once been so neatly orchestrated was now twisted, distorted by an act of silent defiance. Samuel Hargrove paced restlessly in the mansion, his mind unraveling as he thought of his wife. He had never truly loved Margaret, not in the way he had loved the idea of his position, his power. But her loss had left a bitter taste in his mouth, a deep sense of betrayal and helplessness that gnawed at his very core. His authority, which had seemed invincible just days before, now felt fragile, a thin veneer of control barely holding together. He had no answers. Only frustration. The plantation workers, who had always been so willing to obey, now looked at him with a new, unsettling clarity. The silence they had once obeyed had now taken on a different meaning, a power of its own. The fear of punishment no longer worked in the same way. The overseers grew paranoid, often lashing out without provocation, but the enslaved workers remained silent, silent in their defiance, silent in their strength. But it wasn't just the workers who were affected. Word of Margaret's fate spread quickly, reaching neighboring plantations and beyond. The story of the overseer's wife, her sudden disappearance, the eerie silence of the plantation became a forbidden legend. The whispered tale of the deaf slave, who had taken revenge without a single sound, was passed from one estate to another. It was a story that both terrified and inspired. For the enslaved people who had witnessed the event, the message was clear. They were not powerless. They were no longer invisible. Elijah's silent act of vengeance had given them something far more valuable than physical freedom. It had given them a voice, a sense of their own humanity that could not be crushed under the weight of cruelty and oppression. As for Elijah, his fate remained unknown. Some believed he had escaped, slipping away into the nearby woods, disappearing into the night. Others whispered that he had been caught, hidden away in the depths of the estate, awaiting his punishment. But the truth was more elusive. Elijah had vanished, leaving behind only the legacy of his silent revenge. Chike, the quiet leader of the enslaved, knew that the plantation would never be the same. The Hargrove family would attempt to reassert their control, but they would always remember the cost of their cruelty. The silence that Elijah had embraced, the silence that had made his act of revenge so powerful, would now be a part of the plantation's history. It would be the story that was passed down, whispered among the workers, shared as a lesson in courage, in defiance. The Darnell estate continued to function, but there was a crack in its foundation, a fracture that could never be mended. The overseers had lost their grip on the workers. and the workers had gained something they had never had before: a shared sense of agency, of strength, and of defiance. They no longer worked in fear of punishment. Instead, they worked with the knowledge that they had the power to change the course of their own lives. And as for Elijah, his legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed his revenge. The silent slave, who had taken what was his in a moment of quiet fury, had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of oppression, there was room for rebellion, for courage, and for the quiet power of the human spirit. The Darnell plantation would never forget the night Elijah took his revenge, and neither would the world outside its walls. The story of the deaf slave who couldn't hear his master beg would spread far beyond the estate into the hearts of those who had suffered, and into the minds of those who thought their power was absolute. Elijah's silence had become his voice, and his voice had become a legacy that would never be silenced again.